My mother changed her $5 million will just before dying, and I just found out why. The truth has left me staring at these legal documents spread across my kitchen table at 3 in the morning, my hands trembling as I piece together a puzzle that reveals not just the woman I thought I knew, but the devastating secret she carried for 37 years. I should start at the beginning, though I'm not entirely sure where that is anymore. Everything I believed about my life, my family, my very identity, has been turned upside down in the past 72 hours. But I suppose it began 3 weeks ago when Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, my mother, died peacefully in her sleep at Mercy General Hospital, or at least that's what I thought was the beginning. The funeral was everything she would have wanted, dignified, well-attended, with enough flowers to stock a greenhouse. Mother had always been particular about appearances, and even in death, she managed to orchestrate the perfect farewell. The First Presbyterian Church was packed with colleagues from her 40-year career as a high school English teacher, former students who'd traveled from across the country, neighbors, and the various charity board members she'd worked alongside for decades. I delivered the eulogy, of course. As her only child, it fell to me to sum up a life that seemed, from the outside, remarkably complete. Margaret Whitmore had been born in 1954 to working-class parents, had put herself through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, had dedicated her life to education and community service. She'd never married, a fact that had always puzzled me, given how beautiful and accomplished she was. But she'd raised me with such devotion and care that I'd never felt the absence of a father figure too keenly. Standing at that podium, looking out at the sea of faces, I spoke about her strength, her integrity, her unwavering moral compass. I talked about how she'd worked 2 jobs to put me through medical school, never complaining, never making me feel guilty for the sacrifices she made. I spoke about the woman who had taught me that character was measured not by what you achieved, but by how you treated others when no one was watching. Everything I said was true as far as I knew then. But truth, I've learned, is a slippery thing. It can exist in layers, with the surface truth hiding something far more complex underneath. The reading of the will should have been routine. Mother had always been organized, methodical. She told me for years that everything would be mine: the house in Riverside Heights, her modest savings, her small investment portfolio. She'd lived frugally her entire life, and I'd estimated her estate at maybe $200,000, enough to pay off my student loans and make a decent down payment on a house of my own. Richard Pemberton, the family lawyer who'd handled Mother's affairs for over 20 years, called me into his downtown office exactly 1 week after the funeral. I expected to spend 30 minutes signing papers and another 30 minutes listening to him reminisce about Mother's prudent financial planning. Instead, I spent 3 hours trying to process information that made no sense. "The total estate," Richard said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the documents, "amounts to $5,200,000. I actually laughed. "I'm sorry, did you say 5 million? 5.2, to be precise." He slid a portfolio across his mahogany desk. "Your mother was quite the investor, David. She'd been building this portfolio for decades. Blue chip stocks, municipal bonds, some very shrewd real estate investments made through shell companies." I stared at the numbers on the page, but they might as well have been written in Sanskrit. "This can't be right. My mother was a teacher. She drove a 15-year-old Honda. She clipped coupons. She was also extremely disciplined with her money and had an exceptional understanding of long-term investments." Richard's voice carried a note of admiration. "I've been her financial advisor for 20 years, David, and I watched her turn a modest inheritance from her parents into something substantial through careful planning and remarkable patience." The room felt like it was tilting. I loosened my tie, trying to process this revelation. My mother, who'd raised me in a modest 3-bedroom house, who'd worked summer school and tutored students to make ends meet, who'd mended her clothes rather than buying new ones. This woman had been sitting on over $5 million? Why didn't she ever tell me? I asked, though I wasn't really expecting an answer. "Margaret was a very private person," Richard said carefully. "She believed in the value of work, of earning one's way. She didn't want wealth to change you or make you complacent. But $5 million, Richard. She could have. I struggled to find words. She could have traveled. She always wanted to see Europe. She could have retired early, enjoyed her life more. She seemed quite content with her choices, he replied. But there was something in his tone, a hesitation that made me look up from the papers. What aren't you telling me? Richard removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, a stalling technique I recognized from the few times I'd needed his legal services over the years. There's something else, David. The will was changed just 4 days before your mother died. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Changed how? The previous will left everything to you directly. The new will establishes a trust. He handed me another document, this one bearing a recent date and my mother's familiar, careful signature. As I read, my confusion deepened. The Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore Trust was complex, with specific instructions for the distribution of funds. The majority of the money, $4 million, was to be held in trust and distributed in annual installments to various educational charities over the next 20 years. $1 million was to be set aside for my own education expenses, though since I was already a practicing physician, I wasn't sure what that meant. But it was the final provision that made my blood run cold. $200,000 was to be paid immediately to one Elena Rodriguez of San Antonio, Texas, with a sealed letter to be delivered to her at the same time. Another sealed letter was to be given to me, but only after Elena Rodriguez had been contacted and the money transferred to her account. "Who is Elena Rodriguez?" I asked, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "Your mother never explained that provision to me. She simply insisted it be included and that the letters be delivered in exactly that order. Elena first, then you." I stared at the unfamiliar name, feeling like I was looking at evidence of a crime I couldn't identify. Elena Rodriguez. The name meant nothing to me, but it had meant enough to my mother that she'd changed her will 4 days before dying to ensure this woman received what was, by most people's standards, a life-changing sum of money. "Have you contacted her yet?" "Yes. Yesterday. The money was transferred this morning and the letter was delivered by courier. Which means—" Richard opened his desk drawer and withdrew a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Mother's precise handwriting. "I can now give you this." My hands were shaking as I took the envelope. It was heavier than I'd expected, and I could feel something besides paper inside, something small and hard. "Would you like some privacy?" Richard asked. I nodded, unable to speak. He stepped out of his office, closing the door behind him, and I was alone with what I was beginning to suspect would be the most important letter I'd ever read. The envelope opened easily, as if Mother had wanted to ensure that when the time came, nothing would prevent me from learning whatever she'd hidden from me for 37 years. Inside were 3 handwritten pages in her familiar script and a small tarnished key. "My dearest David," the letter began, and even seeing those words in her handwriting made my eyes fill with tears. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and Richard has followed my instructions regarding the will. I know you must be confused and perhaps hurt that I kept so much from you for so long. I pray that by the time you finish reading this letter, you will understand why I made the choices I did, even if you cannot forgive them. First, you must know that everything I told you about your father was a lie. I told you that he was a young man I met in college, that we were briefly engaged, that he died in a car accident before you were born. None of that is true. Your father is very much alive, or at least he was as of 6 months ago when I last checked. His name is Miguel Rodriguez, and Elena is his wife. I know this must be a shock, David, but please keep reading. The whole truth is more complicated than you can imagine. I met Miguel in the summer of 1986. I was 32, he was 28. I was teaching summer school to earn extra money, and he was working construction, helping to renovate the old gymnasium at Henderson High School. He'd recently immigrated from Mexico with his young wife and infant daughter, looking for a better life, the way so many people do. I should have left him alone. I knew he was married from the first day I saw him. He wore his wedding ring proudly, and he talked about his family constantly. But David, I had never felt anything like what I felt for that man. It was as if I'd been sleepwalking through my entire life until I met him. The affair lasted 3 months. I am not proud of it, and I won't insult your intelligence by trying to justify it. I was a 32-year-old woman who should have known better, who did know better, but who was so desperately lonely and so completely overwhelmed by feelings I'd never experienced that I made choices that hurt innocent people. When I discovered I was pregnant with you, Miguel begged me to terminate the pregnancy. Not because he didn't want you, but because he knew what it would do to his family if the truth came out. His wife, Elena, was pregnant again, and they were just beginning to establish themselves in our community. A scandal would have destroyed them. I couldn't do what he asked, David. I knew from the moment I realized you were growing inside me that you were the best thing that would ever happen to me. But I also knew that telling the truth would destroy at least 3 lives, Miguel's, Elena's, and that of their unborn child. So I did what I thought was best for everyone involved. I broke off the affair, told Miguel I would handle everything, and created the story about your deceased father. Miguel and his family moved to San Antonio shortly after you were born. As far as I know, Elena never learned about the affair or about you. I have carried this secret for 37 years, David. There were so many times I wanted to tell you the truth, especially when you asked questions about your father, when you wondered about your heritage, when you struggled with feeling incomplete because you thought half of your identity was missing. But every time I considered telling you, I thought about Elena Rodriguez and what it would do to her to learn that her husband had fathered another child during their marriage. The money I'm leaving her, I know it seems arbitrary, but it's not. Over the years, I've kept track of the Rodriguez family. Miguel works in construction, Elena cleans houses. They've raised 5 children on wages that barely cover their basic needs. They've never been able to afford the things that my teaching salary and careful investments allowed us to have. In some ways, my economic security was built on the foundation of their struggle, because Miguel's affair with me happened during a time when he should have been focused entirely on supporting his growing family. I realize that $200,000 cannot undo 37 years of deception, but it's my attempt to acknowledge the debt I feel I owe her. She deserves to know why she's receiving this money, which is why I've written to her as well, telling her the truth about Miguel and me and about you. The key I've included with this letter opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank, box number 847. Inside that box, you'll find photographs of Miguel, letters he wrote me during our affair, and other documents I've kept all these years. I don't know if you'll want to see them, but I wanted you to have the choice. More importantly, you'll find a letter Miguel wrote to you before you were born. He asked me to give it to you someday when you were old enough to understand. I never did, because I was too afraid of the consequences. But you're a grown man now, a doctor, someone who has built a good life based on your own merits and character. You deserve to know who your father is, and you deserve to decide for yourself whether you want that knowledge to be part of your life. I know you probably hate me right now, David. I know this revelation changes everything you thought you knew about yourself and about me. But please believe me when I tell you that every decision I made was motivated by love for you, love for Miguel, and yes, even love for Elena and the family I helped to disrupt. I am not asking for your forgiveness, because I know that what I've done may be unforgivable. But I am asking you to understand that sometimes people make impossible choices in impossible situations. And sometimes those choices create consequences that ripple out for decades. You are the most important thing I have ever done with my life, David. You are brilliant and compassionate and strong, and those qualities come from who you are, not from the circumstances of your conception. Whether you choose to contact your biological father or not, whether you can forgive me or not, please know that loving you and raising you has been the greatest privilege of my life. With all my love and deepest regrets, Mother. P.S. I have left most of my estate to educational charities because I believe that's what you would have wanted me to do. The money I accumulated was never really mine. It came from the opportunities that my education provided, and it should go back to creating opportunities for others. But I've set aside enough to ensure that if you want to pursue additional training or education, you'll have the resources to do so without financial worry. I read the letter 3 times before I could process what it was telling me. Then I sat in Richard's office for another hour, staring at the key in my palm, trying to reconcile this new version of my mother with the woman who had raised me. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, the woman who had taught me about integrity and honesty, had built our entire relationship on a fundamental lie. But even as anger and betrayal surged through me, I couldn't ignore the love that permeated every word of her confession. She had lied to protect people, not just herself, but Miguel, Elena, and even me. But Elena Rodriguez knew the truth now. According to Richard, the money had been transferred and the letter delivered that very morning. Somewhere in San Antonio, a woman I'd never met was learning that her husband had fathered a child 37 years ago, and that child was me. I called in sick to the hospital for the rest of the week and drove to the bank to open the safe deposit box. Richard had arranged for the key to be activated, and I found myself in the sterile, windowless room where people keep their most important secrets. Box 847 was larger than I'd expected, and it was packed with items my mother had collected over nearly 4 decades. The photographs were the first thing I pulled out, and seeing them was like looking into a mirror that reflected back through time. Miguel Rodriguez at 28 looked remarkably like me at the same age. The same dark eyes, the same slightly crooked smile, the same way of standing with one shoulder slightly raised. In photo after photo, I saw features I'd wondered about my entire life, expressions I'd made unconsciously, mannerisms I'd thought were uniquely mine. He was handsome in a way that made it easy to understand how my mother had lost her head. But more than that, he looked kind. In every photograph, even the ones where he was clearly unaware he was being photographed, there was a gentleness about him, a warmth that radiated even through the old Polaroids. The letters were harder to read. They were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, and they revealed a man torn apart by his feelings for my mother and his loyalty to his family. In one he wrote, "Margaret, I know this has to end. I love Elena, I love my daughter, and I cannot destroy their lives for my own happiness, but when I look at you, I forget everything else in the world. This is wrong, but it doesn't feel wrong, and I don't know how to reconcile those two truths." In another, "You told me today that you think you might be pregnant. If this is true, we have to decide what we're going to do. I cannot abandon my family, but I cannot abandon you either, and I cannot abandon our child if there is one. Help me understand how to be an honorable man in a situation where honor seems impossible." But it was the letter addressed to me that broke me completely. "To my son," it began, written in careful English with occasional Spanish words when the emotion seemed too big for his second language. "I do not know if you will ever read this, or if Margaret will ever give it to you, but I wanted you to know that your father thinks about you every day. By the time you are old enough to understand this letter, you will be a young man, and I will be someone you have never met. I want you to know that this is not because I did not want to know you. I have wanted to know you since the moment your mother told me she was carrying you. But wanting something and being able to have it are different things, mijo. I have a family, a wife who loves me and trusts me, children who depend on me, and I made choices that put all of that at risk. Your mother, she is protecting my family by letting them believe you do not exist. It is a sacrifice she is making not just for me, but for people she has never met. I know this must be confusing and probably hurtful. You might wonder why your father abandoned you, why he chose his other children over you. But that is not what happened. I did not choose them over you. I chose to honor a commitment I made before I knew you existed, and your mother chose to let me do that because she understood what it would cost other innocent people if I made a different choice. That does not make it fair to you. You deserved to have your father in your life. You deserve to know your sisters and your brother. You deserve to know about your Mexican heritage, about your grandparents and tias and tios who would have loved you if they had known about you. I can only hope that Margaret has been enough family for both of us, and that she has raised you to be the kind of man I would have been proud to call my son. If you're reading this, it probably means that Margaret is gone, and you are trying to understand who you are and where you came from. I want you to know that you come from love. even if that love was complicated and caused pain to people who didn't deserve it. You come from a father who has thought about you every day for your entire life, who has wondered if you look like him or your mother, who has imagined what your voice sounds like and what makes you laugh and what you worry about at night. You come from a mother who loved you enough to give up everything she wanted to make sure you had the best life possible, even if that meant she had to carry a secret that must have been very heavy for a very long time. I do not know if you will want to know me now that you are grown. I do not know if learning about me will make your life better or worse. But I want you to know that if you ever want to meet your father, if you ever want to ask me questions or tell me about your life, I will be honored to listen. I will be proud of you no matter what you have become, because I know that Margaret raised you, and Margaret is the best person I have ever known. Con amor, your papa, Miguel Rodriguez. I cried for the first time since Mother's funeral, sitting in that sterile bank room surrounded by the artifacts of a secret that had shaped my entire life without my knowledge. I cried for the father I'd never known, for the family I'd never met, for the mother who'd carried this burden alone for 37 years, but mostly I cried for Elena Rodriguez, who was at that very moment learning that her life had been built on incomplete information, that the man she'd loved and trusted had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible, and that the evidence of that betrayal, me, had been living just a few hours away for nearly 4 decades. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with questions I didn't know how to answer. Should I contact Miguel? Should I try to reach Elena? Did I have the right to disrupt their lives further, or was the damage already done by Mother's posthumous confession? For 3 days, I did nothing except pace around my apartment, calling in sick to work and ignoring phone calls from concerned friends. I read and reread Mother's letter and Miguel's letter until I had them memorized. I studied the photographs until I could see my own features clearly in his face. On the 4th day, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. The number had a San Antonio area code. Dr. Whitmore? The voice was heavily accented, female, older. This is Elena Rodriguez. I think we need to talk. My hands started shaking. Mrs. Rodriguez, Yes, we do. My husband, he does not know I am calling you. He does not know I know about you, but I received a letter and money from your mother, and I have been thinking about nothing else since then. I'm so sorry, I began, but she cut me off. Do not apologize to me for existing, she said firmly. You did nothing wrong. We need to meet, I think. There are things you need to know, and things I need to understand. I can drive to San Antonio, I offered immediately. No, I will come there. Miguel, he thinks I am visiting my sister in Dallas this weekend, but I will come to you instead. Send me your address. 2 days later, I was pacing my living room when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a small, silver-haired woman in her 60s, holding a manila envelope and looking as nervous as I felt. Elena Rodriguez was not what I had expected, though I'm not sure what I had expected. She was petite and elegant, with kind eyes and a straightforward manner that reminded me, strangely, of my mother. She accepted my offer of coffee and sat on my couch with the careful posture of someone who was determined to maintain her dignity in a difficult situation. You look like him, she said without preamble, like Miguel, when he was young. I would have known you were his son, even without the letter. Mrs. Rodriguez, I began, but she held up a hand. Elena. We are family now, I think, whether we want to be or not. She opened the manila envelope and withdrew several photographs. These are your half-siblings. Maria, she is 36 now, married with 3 children. Carlos is 34, he is a mechanic like his father. Ana is 32, she teaches kindergarten. Roberto is 29, he works for the city. And Carmen, the baby, she is 26 and just finished nursing school. She handed me the photographs, and I found myself looking at faces that shared my features. The same dark eyes, the same smile, the same way of tilting their heads when they were thinking. It was like looking at alternate versions of myself, lives I might have lived if things had been different. They don't know about me, I said. It wasn't a question. No. Miguel, he has never told them, and I have never asked him about it. But I have always known. I looked up from the photographs, surprised. Always. Elena smiled, but it was a sad expression. Miguel is a good man, Dr. Whitmore, but he is not a good liar. When he came home from that construction job in 1986, he was different, distant, guilty. He would stare off into space, and when I asked what he was thinking about, he would say nothing in a way that let me know it was definitely something important. She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. Then, in early 1987, he started asking strange questions. Had I ever thought about what it would be like to have another baby? Did I think our children would be happy to have another brother or sister? Was I satisfied with our life, or did I sometimes wish things were different? You knew he was talking about me. I suspected, and then in July of 1987, he came home from work and told me that we needed to move to San Antonio. He had found a better job, he said, more opportunities for the family. We left within a month. I stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was telling me. You've known about me for 37 years? I have known that Miguel had a son he was not raising. I did not know your name or where you were or anything about your mother until 4 days ago. She set down her coffee cup and looked at me directly. But yes, I have known about you. And you never said anything? Never confronted him? Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. What would have been the purpose? To hurt him, to hurt our children, to destroy our family over something that was already finished. But didn't you want to know the truth? I knew the truth that mattered to me. Miguel loved me and our children. He worked hard to support us. He was a good husband and father. The fact that he had made a mistake, that he had loved someone else for a short time, that was painful, but it was not the most important truth about who he was. I was struggling to understand her perspective. But what about me? Didn't you think about the fact that there was a child out there who didn't know his father? For the first time since she'd arrived, Elena's composure cracked slightly. Of course I thought about it. I prayed about it. I wondered what kind of life you were having, whether your mother was taking good care of you, whether you were happy. She paused, studying my face. Your mother, in her letter, she told me that you became a doctor. She told me you are a good man, that you have a good life. That brings me peace. But you could have, Miguel could have. Could have what? Elena interrupted. Could have torn apart two families instead of one? Could have forced you to grow up in the middle of a scandal that would have hurt everyone involved? Could have made my children wonder if their father loved them less because he had another child somewhere else? She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Dr. Whitmore, David, I have spent 37 years thinking about this situation. I have imagined every possible way it could have been handled differently. And I believe that your mother made the right choice as much as it must have cost her. The right choice? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. She lied to me my entire life. She let me grow up thinking my father was dead. She let you grow up without the burden of knowing that your existence was a source of pain and complication for people you had never met, Elena corrected gently. She let you build your identity on your own merits, not on the circumstances of how you came to be. I got up and walked to the window, trying to process everything she was telling me. Outside, people were going about their normal Saturday activities, walking dogs, washing cars, playing with children in the park across the street. Their lives seemed impossibly simple compared to the complexity Elena was describing. Do you think I should meet him? I asked without turning around. Miguel? That is not my decision to make, Elena replied, but I will tell you what I think. I think Miguel has wanted to know you every day since you were born. I think he has wondered about you constantly and regretted the choices that kept him from being your father. But I also think he would never reach out to you first, because he knows that doing so might disrupt the life you have built. I turned back to her. And what do you think about that? Elena smiled, and for the first time, it was a genuinely warm expression. I think that you are 37 years old and perfectly capable of making your own decisions about who you want in your life. I think that Miguel is 65 years old and has spent enough years wondering about his firstborn son. and I think that our other children deserve to know they have a brother who is a doctor and who was raised by a woman brave enough to sacrifice her own happiness to protect our family. You want me to meet them. I want you to meet all of us, if that is what you want. I want you to know that you have a family in San Antonio who has always wondered about you. I want my children to know that they have a brother who exists, who is successful and good, who is part of their story, whether they have known it or not. She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of paper with an address written on it. This is where we live. Miguel will be at work tomorrow. He works construction on Sundays to make extra money. If you want to surprise him, you could come then. Or I can talk to him first, prepare him. Whatever feels right to you. I took the paper, feeling the weight of the decision it represented. What will you tell him about our conversation? The truth. That his son came to see what kind of woman had raised his other children, and that his son decided we were worth knowing. After Elena left, I spent the evening looking at the photographs she'd given me. My half-siblings were scattered across the spectrum of life, some married, some single, some with children of their own. They had Miguel's features and Elena's kind expressions, and looking at them I felt a strange sense of completion, as if a puzzle I hadn't known was incomplete suddenly had all its missing pieces. I called the hospital and arranged to take the next day off. Then I got in my car and started driving toward San Antonio, not entirely sure what I was going to say when I got there, but knowing that I needed to see the man who had been a question mark my entire life. The Rodriguez house was in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of San Antonio, a small, well-maintained home with a carefully tended garden and toys in the yard that suggested grandchildren visited regularly. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, gathering courage, before finally walking to the front door. Elena answered, dressed for church, and smiled when she saw me. I thought you might come today. Miguel is in the backyard, working on the fence. Are you ready? I nodded, though I wasn't sure ready was the right word for what I was feeling. The backyard was small but beautifully landscaped, with fruit trees and vegetable gardens and a small patio where a man with graying hair was kneeling next to a section of wooden fencing, replacing a broken board. Miguel, Elena called, there is someone here to see you. He looked up, and the moment our eyes met, I saw recognition flash across his face. He didn't need Elena to tell him who I was. 37 years dissolved in an instant, and I was looking at my father. Miguel stood slowly, setting down his tools, his gaze never leaving my face. He was older, of course, with lines around his eyes and gray in his hair, but he was unmistakably the man from the photographs in Mother's safe deposit box, and I was unmistakably his son. David, he said, my name coming out like a prayer. Hello, Miguel. For a moment we just stood there, two men separated by a small yard and 37 years of silence. Then Miguel walked toward me, and when he was close enough to touch, he stopped and searched my face with eyes that were exactly like mine. You look like your mother, he said finally, but you have my stubborn chin. I laughed, surprised by how easy it felt. She never told me that. There were probably many things she never told you. His English was accented but clear, and his voice carried the weight of decades of regret. I have wanted to meet you since the day you were born, David. But I did not know if I had the right. Elena thinks you do. Miguel glanced back at his wife, who was watching us from the patio with tears in her eyes. Elena is wiser than me about many things. She always has been. She told me she's known about me all along. Miguel nodded, his expression guilty and admiring at the same time. Elena knows everything that matters. She just lets me pretend she doesn't know the things that would hurt us to talk about. We stood there for another moment, and then Miguel asked, Would you like to see pictures of your brothers and sisters? Elena says she showed you some, but I have more. And I would like to hear about your life if you want to tell me. I nodded, and we spent the next 3 hours on the patio looking through photo albums and talking. Miguel told me about each of my half-siblings, their personalities and accomplishments and struggles. I told him about medical school, about my work at the hospital, about the life Mother had built for me. Margaret was a remarkable woman, he said when I finished describing her dedication to my education. She sacrificed everything, to make sure you had opportunities that Elena and I could never have given our children. She loved you, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Even after all these years, I could tell from her letter that she never stopped loving you. Miguel's eyes filled with tears. I never stopped loving her either. But love and commitment are not the same thing, and I had commitments that came before I met her. Do you regret it? The affair? He considered the question seriously. I regret the pain it caused Elena. I regret the confusion it caused you. But I cannot regret something that gave me a son. He looked at me directly. Even if I could never claim you, you have been in my heart every day of your life. Before I left that afternoon, Elena insisted on cooking dinner, and we called each of my half-siblings to tell them they had a brother. The conversations were surreal, trying to explain to people my own age that I existed, that I was their father's son, that our family was suddenly larger than they had known. Maria cried. Carlos laughed and said he'd always suspected something because Miguel talked in his sleep sometimes and had mentioned someone named David. Ana immediately started asking if I was married and whether I wanted children because she thought I would be a wonderful father. Roberto was quiet, processing, but asked if I would come to his wedding next spring. Carmen, the youngest, was excited and wanted to know if I would teach her children about being a doctor. It was overwhelming and wonderful and completely surreal. In the space of a single afternoon, I went from being an only child to being the oldest of 6 siblings, from being fatherless to having a father who had thought about me every day for 37 years. When I finally left San Antonio that evening, I had plans to return the following weekend and phone numbers for 5 siblings I was eager to get to know. But more than that, I had a new understanding of the woman who had raised me. The drive back to Dallas gave me 4 hours to process everything that had happened. I thought about Mother's letter, about her insistence that she had made her choices out of love. I had been angry when I first read those words, feeling that love couldn't justify such a fundamental deception. But after meeting Elena, after seeing the family that would have been torn apart by the truth, I was beginning to understand the impossible position Mother had found herself in. She had loved Miguel enough to let him go. She had loved me enough to raise me alone. And she had loved Elena and Miguel's children enough to protect them from knowledge that would have changed their lives in ways they couldn't control. But it was more than that. As I replayed the conversations with Elena and Miguel, I realized that Mother's choice had given me something precious. The freedom to build my identity without the weight of family drama or divided loyalties. I had grown up secure in her love, focused on my education and career, never doubting my worth or wondering if I was loved less than other children. In some ways, her lie had been a gift. Still, there was a part of me that felt cheated. I thought about all the family gatherings I had missed, all the birthday parties and holidays and graduations. I thought about growing up as an only child when I had 5 siblings I could have known. I thought about the cultural heritage I had been denied, the Spanish language, the traditions, the extended family in Mexico that I had never known existed. When I got home, I found myself looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for traces of Miguel that I had never recognized before. Now that I knew what to look for, I could see him everywhere, in the shape of my hands, in the way I stood, in expressions I made when I was thinking. I called my best friend from medical school, Jake, and tried to explain what had happened. But even as I told him about the will, the letters, and the family in San Antonio, I realized how impossible the situation was to explain to someone who hadn't lived it. So, your mom was basically sitting on $5 million while raising you like you were poor, Jake asked, focusing on the aspect of the story that seemed most tangible to him. She wasn't raising me like we were poor, I corrected. She was raising me to understand the value of work, of earning things myself. And we weren't poor, we just weren't rich. But dude, $5 million. You could have gone to any college you wanted without student loans. She could have retired early, traveled, enjoyed her money. She did enjoy her money, I realized as I said it. She enjoyed knowing that it would go to causes she cared about after she died. She enjoyed the security it gave her. And she enjoyed knowing that if I ever really needed it, it would be there. Jake was quiet for a moment. And you're okay with that? With her giving most of it away? I think so. It feels right, somehow. She was a teacher her whole life. It makes sense that her money would go back to education. I paused, thinking. Besides, I have more family now than money could ever buy. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine of calling someone in San Antonio every few days. I talked to Miguel about his work, his memories of coming to America, his dreams for his grandchildren. I talked to Elena about cooking and gardening and her volunteer work at their church. Each of my siblings had distinct personalities and lives, and getting to know them felt like discovering rooms in a house I had always lived in but never fully explored. Maria, the oldest of my half-siblings, was married to a teacher and had 3 children. She was serious and thoughtful, much like Mother had been, and she asked careful questions about my childhood that told me she was trying to understand how the brother she had never known had been shaped by experiences she couldn't imagine. Carlos was funny and irreverent, a mechanic who could fix anything and who seemed to find humor in even the most serious situations. When I told him I was a doctor, he immediately started joking about how he fixed cars and I fixed people, and weren't we basically in the same business? Anna was the nurturer of the family, the one everyone called when they needed advice or comfort. She taught kindergarten and had an instinctive understanding of how to make complicated things simple. She helped me understand family dynamics and traditions that I had never been part of but wanted to learn about. Roberto was quiet and observant, much like I tended to be. He worked for the city's parks department and had an encyclopedic knowledge of San Antonio's history and culture. Through him, I began to understand the community my father's family had built their lives around. Carmen, the youngest, was just starting her career as a nurse, and she peppered me with questions about medical school and hospital life. She was ambitious and determined, much like I had been at her age, and talking to her reminded me of how much Mother had sacrificed to support my own ambitions. But it was my relationship with Miguel that surprised me the most. I'd expected awkwardness, guilt, maybe resentment on both sides. Instead, I found that talking to him felt natural, as if we were resuming a conversation that had been interrupted rather than starting one that had never begun. He told me stories about his childhood in Mexico, about the journey north that had led him to Texas, about the early years of his marriage when he and Elena had struggled to establish themselves in a new country. He talked about the construction work that had brought him to my mother's school, about the man he had been then, young, ambitious, but also naive about the complexities of the heart. I had never met anyone like Margaret, he told me during one of our phone calls. Elena and I, we grew up in the same village. We understood each other because we came from the same place. But Margaret, she was educated, sophisticated. She had traveled and read books and had ideas about the world that I had never heard before. Being with her was like discovering that there were colors I had never seen. But you chose Elena, I said, not accusingly, just trying to understand. I had already chosen Elena, he corrected gently. Long before I met your mother, I had promised to build a life with Elena. Breaking that promise would have made me someone I could not live with being. Even though you loved Mother. Miguel was quiet for a long moment. David, I want you to understand something about love. There are different kinds of love, and they require different kinds of responses. I loved your mother with a passion that felt like it could consume everything else in my life. But I loved Elena with a steadiness that was the foundation of who I was. One kind of love made me feel alive, but the other kind of love made me feel like a good man. I found myself thinking about Mother's letter again, about her description of Miguel as someone torn between his feelings and his commitments. Do you think she understood that? Mother, I mean. I think Margaret understood it better than I did, Miguel replied. She knew that if I left my family for her, I would become the kind of man who abandons his responsibilities when something better comes along. And she knew that if she forced me to choose, she would be asking me to become someone neither of us could respect. So she chose for both of you. She chose to love me enough to let me honor my other commitments, and she chose to love you enough to raise you without the burden of divided loyalties. His voice became softer. It was the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me, David. She gave me the chance to remain the man she had fallen in love with. These conversations helped me understand Mother's decision in a new way. I had been thinking about her choices in terms of deception and sacrifice, but Miguel helped me see them as acts of profound wisdom and love. She had looked at an impossible situation and found a solution that preserved everyone's dignity and protected the innocent. But understanding her choice didn't make the consequences of it any easier to process. I was still dealing with the fundamental fact that my entire identity had been built on incomplete information. Every assumption I had made about myself, every story I had told about my family, every decision I had made about my life had been influenced by a version of events that wasn't true. It was Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a colleague at the hospital who had become a friend, who helped me see the situation differently. Patricia was a psychiatrist, and when I finally told her what had happened, she listened with the kind of professional attention that made me feel like my confusion was valid rather than self-indulgent. "You're grieving," she told me over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "You're grieving the version of your mother you thought you knew, and you're grieving the version of yourself you thought you were." "But I'm also discovering new family, new connections," I protested. "Shouldn't that balance out the sense of loss?" "Grief and joy aren't mutually exclusive," Patricia explained. "You can be happy about finding your father and siblings while still being sad about the years you didn't have with them. You can be grateful for the way your mother raised you while still feeling betrayed by the lies she told you. So what am I supposed to do with all of these contradictory feelings?" Patricia smiled. "Feel them. All of them. Don't try to resolve them or make them make sense. Just let yourself experience the full complexity of what you're going through." That conversation gave me permission to stop trying to figure out how I was supposed to feel and just let myself feel everything. Some days I was angry at Mother for lying to me. Other days, I was grateful for the sacrifice she had made. Some days, I was excited about getting to know my new family. Other days, I mourned the relationships I had missed out on. But gradually, over the course of several months, I began to develop a more nuanced understanding of what had happened and what it meant for my life going forward. The key insight came during a conversation with Elena about Mother's decision to give her money. We were sitting in Elena's kitchen during one of my weekend visits, and she was teaching me to make tamales the way Miguel's mother had taught her when she was a young bride. "I have been thinking about why your mother left me that money," Elena said as she showed me how to spread the masa just so. "At first, I thought it was guilt, or maybe pity. But I think it was something else." "What do you think it was?" Elena paused in her work, considering her words carefully. "I think it was acknowledgement. She was acknowledging that my life was affected by choices she made, even though I didn't know about those choices at the time." I looked up from the tamale I was attempting to assemble. "How so?" "When Miguel had the affair with your mother, he was distracted, confused, not fully present with our family. I didn't know why then, but I felt the effects of it. He was working extra hours to avoid being home. He was quiet and distant. When he was home, he was asking strange questions about whether I was happy with our life." She resumed spreading masa, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Then, when you were born, and your mother told him she would handle everything alone, Miguel threw himself into being the perfect husband and father. He was trying to make up for what he felt he had done to us, but he was also trying to prove to himself that he had made the right choice." "And you felt that too?" "Oh, yes. Suddenly, Miguel was home every evening. He was planning family activities. He was working harder to provide for us. In many ways, it was wonderful. I had the husband I had always wanted, but I also had the feeling that he was performing for me rather than just being with me." Elena looked at me directly. "Your existence, David, even though I didn't know about you specifically, shaped my marriage for 37 years. Miguel's guilt about you made him a better husband in some ways, but it also made him a more distant one. He could never fully be present with us because part of him was always wondering about the son he wasn't raising. This perspective had never occurred to me. So Mother's money was her way of acknowledging that?" "I think so. I think she understood that her decision to raise you alone had costs for many people, not just for her and you and Miguel. My children grew up with a father who was loving but also somehow haunted. I lived with a husband who was devoted but also somehow guilty about something I couldn't name." Elena paused in her work again, and her voice became softer. But David, I want you to understand something. Even knowing all of this now, I believe your mother made the right choice. The damage that would have been done by telling the truth 37 years ago would have been much greater than the damage caused by keeping the secret. How can you be so certain? Because I know Miguel, and I know what it would have done to him to abandon his family. He would have been eaten alive by guilt, and that guilt would have poisoned any relationship he tried to build with you. You would have grown up with a father who resented the choice he had been forced to make, and I would have raised children who felt abandoned and confused. She reached over and patted my hand, leaving a small dusting of masa on my skin. Instead, you grew up with a mother who loved you completely and never made you feel like you were the cause of anyone else's pain. Miguel and I raised our children in a stable home with a father who, whatever his private struggles, was committed to being present for them. It wasn't a perfect solution, David, but it was the best solution possible in an imperfect situation. That conversation helped me understand something crucial about Mother's choice. She hadn't just been protecting people from the truth, she had been protecting them from the long-term consequences of having to live with that truth. She had looked ahead and seen how the revelation would have rippled out over decades, affecting not just the immediate family members, but children who hadn't even been born yet. It was a level of moral complexity that I was only beginning to appreciate. Mother hadn't just made a decision about what to do. She had made a decision about what kind of future to create for multiple families across multiple generations. But understanding her reasoning didn't resolve all of my own conflicted feelings. As my relationships with my new family deepened, I sometimes felt overwhelmed by everything I had missed. When Carmen told me about Miguel teaching her to drive, when Carlos described family fishing trips, when Maria showed me pictures from holiday celebrations I had never been part of, I felt a deep sense of loss for experiences I had never known I was supposed to have. Miguel seemed to sense this during one of our conversations. "You are mourning a childhood you never had," he said gently. "But David, the childhood you did have was also real, and it was also valuable." "I know that intellectually," I replied, "but emotionally, it's hard not to feel cheated." "I understand, but let me tell you something about the childhood you would have had if things had been different. You would have grown up in the middle of a broken family with parents who were fighting about adult problems you couldn't understand. You would have watched your mother struggle with being a single parent while your father tried to balance time between two families. You would have had siblings who might have resented you for being the cause of their parents' divorce." Miguel paused, and his voice became earnest. "Instead, you grew up with a mother who chose to dedicate her entire life to making sure you had every opportunity to become the man you wanted to be. You never had to wonder if you were loved, never had to compete for attention, never had to worry about adult problems that weren't your responsibility. But I also never had siblings to play with, or a father to teach me things, or grandparents who spoiled me." "That's true," Miguel acknowledged, "but you also never had to live through your parents' divorce, or watch your father struggle with guilt and divided loyalties, or deal with the stigma that would have followed our families if the truth had come out in 1987. He was right, but it was still difficult to let go of the fantasy of the life I might have had. It was Carmen who finally helped me put this in perspective during a conversation about her own childhood memories. "David, can I tell you something?" she said during one of our phone calls. "Growing up, there was always something sad about Papa. He was a wonderful father, don't misunderstand me, but there was this sadness in him that we could all feel, but none of us understood." "What kind of sadness?" "It was like he was always missing something or someone. Especially around the time of your birthday, though we didn't know that's what it was then. Every July, Papa would get quiet and thoughtful, and Mama would be extra gentle with him. We used to wonder if someone important to him had died in July, but no one would tell us what it was about." Carmen's voice became thoughtful. "Now, I understand that he was missing you. Every year on your birthday, he was probably wondering what you looked like, what you were doing, whether you were happy. In a way, your absence was a presence in our house your whole life." "I'm sorry," I said, feeling guilty that my existence had caused pain to people I'd never met. "Don't be sorry," Carmen said firmly. I'm telling you this to help you understand that you weren't the only one who missed out on having a family. We missed out on having you too. Papa missed out on watching you grow up. Even Mama missed out because she spent 37 years loving a man who was carrying a secret she couldn't help him with. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was warmer. But we have each other now. We can't get back the years we didn't have, but we can make sure the years we have left are full of the family relationships we should have had all along. This perspective helped me stop dwelling on what had been lost and start focusing on what could still be gained. I began to see my situation not as a tragedy of missed opportunities, but as a second chance to build the family relationships that circumstances had prevented earlier. I started spending more time in San Antonio, getting to know each of my siblings individually. I went fishing with Carlos and Roberto, learned to cook traditional Mexican dishes with Maria and Elena, helped Carmen study for her nursing board exams, and talked with Ana about the challenges of working with children. But it was my developing relationship with Miguel that meant the most to me. We began taking long walks together when I visited, talking about everything from his memories of Mexico to his thoughts on current politics. He told me about the work he had done over the decades, schools he had helped build, homes he had renovated, public buildings he had worked on. I may not have been there to raise you, he said during one of these walks, but I helped build the schools that children like you attended. I worked on the hospital where doctors like you save lives. In my own way, I was contributing to the world you were growing up in. It was a beautiful way to think about the connection between us, and it helped me understand that even when we didn't know each other, we had both been working towards similar goals. He through construction that served the community, me through medicine that served individuals. One evening, about 6 months after that first meeting in Elena's backyard, Miguel asked me a question that I had been wondering when he would ask. "David, do you want to meet your grandparents?" I looked up, surprised. "They're still alive." "My parents, yes. They live in Mexico still, in the village where I grew up. They are old. My father is 86, my mother is 83. But they are strong. I was thinking that maybe we could visit them together." The idea of grandparents had never been real to me before. Mother's parents had died before I was born, and the fictional father she had created for me had, naturally, fictional parents who were also conveniently deceased. But here was Miguel, offering to introduce me to living grandparents who could share stories and pass down traditions and love me the way grandparents are supposed to love grandchildren. "Would you want them to know who I am?" I asked. "Or would I just be a friend of the family?" Miguel smiled. "David, my parents have been asking about you since you were born." I stared at him, stunned. "They know about me?" "They know that I have a son in Texas who was raised by his mother. They know that I was not able to be part of your life because of complicated circumstances, but that I have thought about you every day." Miguel's expression became tender. "Mexican fathers do not easily keep secrets from their mothers, especially not secrets about grandchildren." "And they want to meet me?" "They have wanted to meet you for 37 years. My mother still lights candles for you at church, praying for your health and happiness. My father asks about you every time we talk on the phone." The trip to Mexico happened 2 months later. Miguel, Elena, and I drove across the border into a landscape that felt both foreign and familiar, past small towns and farming communities that looked like places I might have visited in dreams. Miguel's village was exactly what I had pictured when I tried to imagine where my father had come from. Small adobe houses with colorful tiles, narrow streets filled with children playing, old men sitting in the shade of mesquite trees, women hanging laundry in backyards filled with chickens and fruit trees. Miguel's parents lived in the house where he had grown up, a small but well-maintained home with thick walls and high ceilings that kept the interior cool even in the heat of the afternoon. When we knocked on the door, it was opened by a tiny woman with silver hair and eyes exactly like Miguel's, exactly like mine. "Mijo," she said to Miguel, embracing him. Then she turned to me and her face crumpled with emotion. "And this is David." I didn't speak Spanish beyond a few basic phrases, but I didn't need to understand the words that poured out of her as she held my face in her weathered hands. Her meaning was clear. She was welcoming home a grandchild she had waited decades to meet. Miguel's father was a quieter man, but when he shook my hand, his grip was strong and his eyes were full of tears. Through Miguel's translation, he told me that I looked like Miguel had at my age, but that I had my grandmother's eyes. We spent 3 days in the village, and I experienced a kind of family life I had never imagined. My grandparents' house was a constant flow of cousins and neighbors and friends, people dropping by to meet the grandson from Texas, bringing food and stories and countless questions about my life in America. My grandmother, who insisted I call her abuela, cooked elaborate meals and sat me down to eat while she told me stories about Miguel's childhood, about the family history I had never known, about relatives scattered across Mexico and the American Southwest. She showed me photographs going back generations, pointing out family resemblances and explaining relationships I was only beginning to understand. Through Miguel's translation, she told me about the prayers she had said for me, about the way she had imagined what I looked like at different stages of my life, about her hopes that someday I would come to visit. She had knitted sweaters for me over the years, she said, even though she didn't know if I would ever receive them. They were packed away in a trunk, waiting. My grandfather took me on walks through the village, showing me the school Miguel had attended, the church where the family had worshipped for generations, the fields where Miguel had worked as a boy. He introduced me to old friends as Miguel's son, the doctor from Texas, with obvious pride. But it was on the last evening of our visit that I had the conversation that changed everything for me. I was sitting with my grandmother on her front porch, watching the sunset and trying to communicate in my limited Spanish while she responded in the few English phrases Miguel had taught her over the years. Miguel was inside talking with his father, and Elena was helping clean up after dinner. Abuela reached over and took my hand, looking at me with the kind of intense attention that transcended language barriers. Then she began to speak in Spanish, slowly and clearly, as if willing me to understand through tone and emotion what I couldn't grasp through vocabulary. I caught fragments: hijo, son; familia, family; amor, love; tiempo, time. But mostly I understood through her expression, through the way she held my hand, through the tears in her eyes. When Miguel came outside and saw us, he sat down to translate. "She says," Miguel began, his own voice thick with emotion, "that she has been waiting 37 years to tell her grandson that he is loved, that he belongs to this family, that he has never been forgotten even when he was far away." My grandmother continued speaking, gesturing toward the village, toward the house, toward me. "She says that a family is not just the people who live in the same house or share the same name," Miguel continued. "A family is people who carry each other in their hearts no matter how much distance or time separates them. She says you have been part of this family since the day you were born, whether you knew it or not." My grandmother squeezed my hand and said something else, looking directly into my eyes. Miguel smiled as he translated. "She says that your mother, this Margaret, she never met, must have been a remarkable woman to raise such a good man without any help from us. She says Margaret did what she could not do. She made sure you grew up safe and educated and strong. She wants to light a candle for Margaret at church tomorrow, to thank her for taking care of our boy when we could not." I started crying then, overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit this woman was showing toward the mother who had kept me hidden from her for nearly 4 decades. Here was a grandmother who could have been resentful, who could have blamed Mother for denying her a relationship with her grandson. Instead, she was grateful to Mother for doing what she saw as the harder job, raising me alone while my father's family lived their lives in peace. That night, as I lay in the small guest room where Miguel had slept as a child, I finally understood what Mother had done and why she had done it. She had looked at an impossible situation and found a solution that preserved the dignity and happiness of everyone involved. She had sacrificed her own desires and needs to protect people she barely knew, and she had done it not out of martyrdom or self-hatred, but out of a kind of love that was bigger than personal fulfillment. She had given Miguel the chance to be the husband and father his family needed him to be. She had given Elena the chance to raise her children in a stable, loving home. She had given my siblings the chance to grow up without the confusion and pain of a family torn apart by adult choices they couldn't understand. And she had given me the chance to build my identity on my own merits, to become the person I was meant to be without the burden of family drama or divided loyalties. She had loved me enough to be both mother and father, to work extra jobs to provide for my education, to sacrifice her own dreams of marriage and companionship so that I could have everything I needed to succeed. But more than that, she had preserved the possibility of this moment, of me sitting in my grandfather's house in Mexico surrounded by family members who loved me not despite my complicated origins, but because of the way those complications had shaped me into the person I had become. The next morning, my grandmother gave me a box filled with the sweaters she had knitted for me over the years. Tiny baby sweaters, child-sized pullovers, teenage jackets, adult cardigans. 37 years of grandmotherly love stitched in wool and packed away in hope. When we returned to San Antonio, I had a different understanding of who I was and where I came from. I wasn't just Margaret Whitmore's son, raised in isolation from his biological family. I was also Miguel Rodriguez's son, part of a large, loving, extended family that had held space for me even when they couldn't hold me. But most importantly, I was the product of an extraordinary act of love and wisdom by a woman who had looked at an impossible situation and found the one solution that would allow everyone involved to live with dignity and integrity. I drove back to Dallas with a sense of completion I had never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. I understood the choices that had shaped my existence, and I felt grateful for every single one of them. The following week, I did something I had been thinking about for months. I went to Mother's grave and had a long, one-sided conversation with her headstone. I told her about meeting Miguel and Elena and my siblings. I told her about my grandparents and the village in Mexico, and the box of sweaters that represented decades of long-distance love. I told her about Elena's wisdom and Miguel's integrity and the family that had welcomed me as if I had never been away. But mostly I told her that I understood now why she had made the choices she had made, and that I was grateful for every sacrifice she had made to give me the life I had lived. "You were right, Mother," I said to the granite headstone with her name and dates carved into it, "about all of it. You gave everyone the best possible chance at happiness, even when it cost you everything you wanted for yourself." I left flowers on her grave, roses, which had been her favorite, and also marigolds, which my grandmother had told me were traditional for honoring the dead in Mexican culture. It seemed appropriate to blend the traditions, to honor both sides of who I was and who I had come from. 6 months later, I was back in San Antonio for Roberto's wedding. I walked into the church and saw my entire family, Miguel and Elena, my 5 siblings and their spouses and children, my grandparents who had flown in from Mexico, aunts and uncles and cousins I was still learning to identify. But what struck me most was how natural it felt to be there, how much I felt like I belonged. These weren't strangers I was trying to get to know. They were family members I had been separated from by circumstances beyond any of our control. During the reception, Miguel and I were standing together watching my siblings dance when he turned to me with a serious expression. "David, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can say no." "What is it?" "My name," he said quietly, "Rodriguez. I know you have your mother's name, and I understand why, and I would never ask you to change it, but if you ever wanted to add Rodriguez, to be David Whitmore Rodriguez, I would be honored." I looked at him, this man who had fathered me but had never had the chance to raise me, who had thought about me every day for 37 years but had never been able to claim me as his son. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like that very much." The paperwork took a few weeks, but 2 months later I received my new driver's license, Dr. David Whitmore Rodriguez. It felt like the completion of a journey I hadn't known I was taking. But the real completion came the following Christmas, the first holiday I spent with my father's family. We were all gathered in Miguel and Elena's living room, and Elena was showing the grandchildren how to make paper flowers for the Christmas tree. The room was full of laughter and conversation in 2 languages, children running around, adults catching up on each other's lives. At one point, I found myself standing in the doorway just watching the scene, marveling at how this chaotic, loving, complicated family had become my family. Carmen appeared beside me with 2 cups of coffee. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I'm thinking about Mother," I replied, "about how she would have loved to see this." "She did see it," Carmen said quietly. Maybe not with her eyes, but she saw it when she made the choices that eventually led to this moment. She saw that someday you would be standing in this room with all of us and that it would be exactly what you needed. She was right. Mother had seen this moment, had planned for it, had made it possible through 37 years of sacrifice and secret keeping. She had given up the chance to know Miguel's family herself so that someday I could know them without guilt or complication. It was, I realized, the most profound act of love I had ever encountered. She had loved me enough to ensure that I could have everything I needed, even if it meant she couldn't have the things she wanted. She had loved Miguel enough to let him be the man he needed to be, even if it meant she had to be alone. She had loved Elena and my siblings enough to protect them from knowledge that would have hurt them, even if it meant carrying a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. And she had done it all while raising me to be the kind of person who could appreciate the full complexity of what she had done, who could integrate the different parts of my heritage without rejecting any of them, who could love both the mother who raised me and the father who didn't, who could understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is make the choice that preserves other people's happiness at the cost of your own. That night, as I drove back to my hotel, I realized that I was no longer angry about the lies Mother had told me. I understood now that they hadn't been lies in the traditional sense. They had been a carefully constructed narrative designed to protect everyone involved from the much more complicated and potentially painful truth. She had given me a story about my origins that allowed me to grow up secure and focused and free from adult drama. She had given Miguel a chance to honor his commitments and be the father his other children needed. She had given Elena the stable marriage she deserved. And she had given all of us the possibility of finding each other when the time was right, when we were mature enough to handle the complexity of our situation. I thought about the $5 million she had accumulated over the years, money she could have spent on travel or comfort or any of the things she had denied herself. Instead, she had saved it so that it could go toward education, toward creating opportunities for other people, the way education had created opportunities for both of us. Even her decision to leave money to Elena wasn't charity or guilt, I realized now. It was acknowledgement. It was her way of saying that Elena's life had been affected by choices Mother had made, and that Elena deserved to benefit from the good fortune that Mother's choices had also created. Everything Mother had done had been part of a larger plan, a way of ensuring that love triumphed over selfishness, that integrity mattered more than personal happiness, that family was about more than blood relations or living in the same house. I pulled into the hotel parking lot but sat in my car for a few more minutes thinking about the conversation I would have with Mother if she were still alive. I would thank her for the sacrifices she had made, but I would also tell her that she had given me something more valuable than a father or siblings or grandparents. She had given me an understanding of what real love looked like. Not the romantic love that burns bright and makes people crazy, but the steady, enduring love that makes people noble. The kind of love that thinks about consequences across decades, that puts other people's welfare ahead of personal desires, that finds ways to preserve dignity and hope even in the most difficult circumstances. The kind of love that changes a $5 million will just before dying to make sure that everyone affected by a 37-year-old decision has a chance at happiness and closure. My mother changed her $5 million will just before dying, and now I know why. She changed it because love isn't just about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go. Sometimes it's about making sure that when you're gone, the people you leave behind have everything they need to heal, to understand, and to move forward together. She changed it because she understood that money without truth is meaningless, but truth without preparation can be devastating. She orchestrated her own death in a way that would force all of us to confront the past while giving us the resources and relationships we would need to build a better future. She changed it because she knew that Elena Rodriguez deserved to know why her marriage had been shaped by shadows she couldn't name, and deserved to have the financial security to process that knowledge without the added stress of economic uncertainty. She changed it because she knew that I deserved to understand where I came from, but only when I was mature enough to handle the complexity of that knowledge and generous enough to use it to build bridges rather than walls. She changed it because she knew that Miguel deserved the chance to finally tell his son that he had thought about him every day for 37 years, and that he had never stopped regretting the circumstances that kept them apart. But mostly she changed it because she had learned something over the course of nearly 4 decades that she wanted to pass on to all of us. That real love is not about possession or control or even personal happiness. Real love is about creating the conditions in which other people can flourish, even if you have to sacrifice your own desires to make that possible. The morning after Roberto's wedding, I was having breakfast with Miguel and Elena when Elena asked me a question that I had been wondering when someone would ask. "David, are you angry with your mother for keeping you from us all these years?" I thought about it for a long moment, stirring my coffee and watching the steam rise from the cup. 6 months earlier, I would have said yes without hesitation. I had felt betrayed, cheated, lied to. I had felt like she had stolen my birthright and forced me to live an incomplete life. But now, sitting in Elena's kitchen with the smell of fresh tortillas in the air and the sound of my nephews playing in the backyard, I understood that Mother hadn't taken anything from me. She had given me everything I needed to become the person I was meant to be, and she had done it in a way that preserved the possibility of this moment, this sense of belonging, this feeling of family, this understanding that love can exist in many forms and still be authentic. "No," I said finally. "I'm not angry anymore. I think she gave me the best life she could give me, and she did it in a way that protected everyone else too. I think she was wiser than any of us understood." Miguel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Your mother was a remarkable woman, David. I loved her for many reasons, but mostly I loved her because she was strong enough to do what was right, even when it cost her everything she wanted." "I wish I could have known her," Elena said quietly. "I think we would have been friends." It was a generous thing to say, and it highlighted something I had come to understand about Elena over the months I had been getting to know her. She was a woman capable of seeing past her own pain to recognize the goodness in others, even when those others had complicated her life in ways she couldn't control. "I think you would have been friends too," I agreed. "You both understand that sometimes loving people means making difficult choices for their benefit." After breakfast, I drove back to Dallas with a sense of completion that I had never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. More importantly, I understood the love that had shaped my existence. Not just Mother's love for me, but her love for Miguel, her love for Elena and my siblings, her love for the community she had served as a teacher, her love for the future students who would benefit from her charitable donations. I thought about the letters she had written to me, about the pain and regret that had permeated every word. She had been asking for my forgiveness, but she had also been trying to help me understand that forgiveness is not always about absolving someone of wrongdoing. Sometimes it's about accepting that people make impossible choices in impossible situations, and that love can be expressed in ways that look like betrayal from the outside, but are actually profound acts of protection and sacrifice. After my presentation, a young woman approached me, a medical student who had been in the audience.
"Dr. Rodriguez," she said, "I was really moved by what you said about family and healing. I'm wondering if you could tell me more about how you developed that perspective." I looked at her, earnest, dedicated, probably not much younger than I had been when I started medical school, and I realized that this was why Mother had left most of her money to educational causes. This young woman and thousands of others like her were the real beneficiaries of Mother's lifetime of careful saving and wise investing. "It's a long story," I told her, "but I'd be happy to share it with you." And every day, as I practiced medicine with the understanding of family and love and sacrifice that she gave me, as Elena uses her resources to help immigrant children, as Carmen heals sick children, as Miguel finally enjoys the peace of having all his children in his life, as my other siblings benefit from having a brother who can share different perspectives and opportunities with them. Every day, Mother's decision to change her will continues to generate healing and connection and love in the world. That is why she changed her will just before dying, not to control us from beyond the grave, but to set us free to love each other in the fullest, most complete way possible. And in the end, that may be the most profound testament to a life well lived that any of us could ask for.